Hello, QVS AP US History students. I hope you had a good fall break. Now that we are in the month of November, everything should get back to normal and all of us will be on the same pace. I was on a little bit of a break last week, near the end of the week, and had some time to enjoy and regroup. So we'll get back to work this week, and in this unit, it's extremely important. I can't express enough the importance of the content of this period in U.S. history from 1754 to 1800. I kind of expressed that in my first video message to you and want to reemphasize it this week as well. As we move into week 2 of Essential Unit 3, there are some important features of the country's history that you need to take into deep consideration. We'll go to the course page and take a look at some of those features, and I'll explain what you need to do this week and how you can make the most of your time by really working effectively for 2 hours per day. If any week this year you do this, I can't express enough the importance of you doing that in week 2 of Essential Unit 3. So let's go to the course page and look around, and I'll explain what you need to do in a little bit more detail. So let me get down to Essential Unit 3. Again, covering the period from 1754 to 1800. So in the first week of activities, we looked at the role that the French and Indian War played in causing revolution, along with the debt that was incurred by the British, which led to the series of taxes. And then we even looked at the philosophical foundations and the impact that the Enlightenment had on the revolutionary period in American history. Ending last week, we took a look at the divisions within the context of the country. So it's important for you to realize that not everybody was fully supportive of the war against the British. And even to a certain extent, we have to consider the role that George III played in contributing to the cause for war. He was very young when he became king, a lot of mismanagement through the 1760s, with a whole series of changes in the political offices of the administrators who supported him, which eventually led to all-out conflict and war. And you looked at that within the context of that activity, the course for war. In week 2, lots of topics that we are going to cover. As we look at the regulator movement within the context of topic 3.6 and the influence of revolutionary ideals, what you're going to see with this movement was, again, the motivations for the people who were looking to rid themselves of British power varied from region to region within the context of the 13 colonies. There was a large degree of disparity, and you're going to see that within the context of this movement in the Carolinas, that contributed much to fervor against the British and even fervor against those upper class within the colonies who controlled colonial legislatures. So start off with that activity. Then we're going to take a look at how revolutionary the American Revolution was, looking at the different causes of the conflict. And considering how revolutionary it was, we really have to take a look at the period after the revolution to see what really changed. Not much changed for women and the role that they played within American society, despite pressure from a lot of women at the time, namely Abigail Adams, who had written to her husband, John Adams, who comes on to become the second president of the United States, saying, "Don't forget the ladies." So not much changed for women after the revolution, and definitely not much changed for those who were enslaved. Slavery continues on and is actually institutionalized within the context of the U.S. Constitution through the 3/5 clause. And it continues on into the 1800s until a civil war is fought between 1861 and 1865. So consider those features when you are looking at this activity, how revolutionary was the American Revolution. And then we get into looking at the Articles of Confederation. This was the first national government in the United States. It lasted from 1781 to 1787. In its mode or structure, it was a confederation, so it was a loose alliance of states, similar to what Benjamin Franklin had proposed with the Albany Plan back in 1754 prior to the start of the French and Indian War. But as a confederation, there were definite weaknesses to it, some strengths as well. Like you're going to look later on in the unit at the Northwest Ordinance of 1785 and 87, which was arguably one of the greatest strengths. But because it was a loose collection of states, it complicated matters as it related to trade, as it related to amending and changing the articles, and that led to conflict. You'll take a look at one of the conflicts in particular, called Shays' Rebellion. And what ended up happening as a result of Shays' Rebellion and other weaknesses within the Articles of Confederation in 1787 in Philadelphia, there was an important event in American history called the Constitutional Convention, when 55 delegates from the 13 different states met in Philadelphia, in secrecy, I'll mention as well, to devise a new plan for government. And at that convention that lasted the summer of 1787 from May to September, they came up with what is the government in the United States today, the US Constitution. There were a lot of arguments that summer and a lot of compromises that were made based on representation, based on leadership, and how long a president should serve. Two divisive forces came into play, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, and one of the central features of their conflict was a Bill of Rights. A Bill of Rights was eventually ratified and added to the U.S. Constitution by 1791, but the argument was over whether or not those rights had to be explicitly stated within the Constitution. And as we move further on into the next activity with topic 3.9, you'll get to look at some of the different features of the Constitution. I would say that it's really divided into three main parts. There is a preamble, which sets out the introduction and the purpose of the document. There are 7 articles to the Constitution, and then today, as it stands, there are 27 amendments. The first 10 amendments being the Bill of Rights. As I said just a few seconds before, they were added to the Constitution in 1791. So in this activity, you'll take a look at the Constitution. The amendments to it kind of shows you how it's changed over time, which is an important feature of the governing document of the United States. It is called a living document because there are articles within the Constitution that allows for it to be changed. And not that you really need to know a lot about how the Constitution is changed. That kind of gets into the whole government aspect of American history, but there are a few different ways, or a couple, I should say, 2 different ways in which the Constitution can be amended, and you can find that within the articles of the Constitution. But again, we're not going to go very deeply into that, but you'll get an overview in this activity of the U.S. Constitution. And then like I said, it's a rough week, so you really have to be spending 2 hours per day on these different topics, because then we're going to get into shaping the new republic. So in the period from 1789 to 1800, that marks the first 2 presidencies of the United States, and that's the presidency of George Washington, followed by John Adams. So in this activity here, you'll be looking at some of the challenges and some of the great accomplishments of both of those administrations. George Washington becomes the first president of the United States. In a lot of ways, he sets precedent for future presidents by only running for 2 terms. At that time, when he was president, and really all the way through World War II, there were not term limits on the office of the presidency, but he was concerned about any one person staying in power for too long. And after his second term in office, he decided not to run for reelection. And his vice president, John Adams, ran and in 1796 became the second president of the United States. And within the context of this activity, as I said, you'll be looking at some of the accomplishments, some of the challenges of those first 2 presidents. John Adams was a great statesman within American history, but he was really poor in terms of leadership. Plus, he struggled. Both of these presidents were in office at the time that the French Revolution had broken out in France. And because the French had aligned themselves with the American colonies during their revolution, there was an expectation on or from the French government that the Americans would support them through their troubled times. And what George Washington did was he signed a proclamation of neutrality, which eventually spilled out into quasi-war during the administration of John Adams. So this kind of complicated things. He lost a lot of favor with the people. And even though he ran for president in 1800, he did not win that election. So you'll be looking at, again, some of the different events during their administrative periods in office. One of the most interesting figures in American history, especially in this early period, is Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton becomes the first Secretary of the Treasury, and he really molds it in so many important ways. He creates or suggests for the creation of a Bank of the United States, which is done. He suggests for the federal government to assume state debt out of the Revolution, which they do. And in his vision for the economic future of America, he greatly differed with Thomas Jefferson, who actually became the first Secretary of the State under George Washington. And as I mentioned a little bit earlier, had become the third president after beating John Adams in 1800 for re-election, or defeating John Adams, who was seeking re-election. So in this activity here, you're going to take a look at the first Secretary of the Treasury and the policies that he created for establishing the economic future of the country. He greatly differed with Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson believed in a more agrarian future or agricultural future, and Hamiltonian policies really were ones that backed the banks and a more industrial future for the country. And we'll kind of then look at, in finishing out the week, developing an American identity. So we'll take a look at some art, some music, some literature in the early American period. And then getting back to the role that women played, we'll look at this concept of Republican motherhood. So you can gain an understanding of how women did contribute greatly to this Republican identity or this Democratic identity that was imbued upon the children within the context of their homes. And then finally, we finish out the week with something that technically goes with the Articles of Confederation. But you'll be looking at movement in the early republic, and one of the most important features that allowed for migration to the frontier or to the west was the Northwest Ordinance. This was a plan for how new states would become organized after the U.S. had gained a significant amount of territory through the Treaty of Paris that was signed in 1783. So that is week 2 in a nutshell. Like I said, lots of work to do. You really need to be working for 2 hours per day, because on top of that, you have all of the textbook pages for notes. Next week is a little bit lighter, but again, you have the test for the unit at the end of next week. So just kind of keep that in mind and kind of pace yourself wisely this week. Maybe you'll even have to work a little bit more than that 2 hours, hopefully not more than 2.5, but contact me if you ever have any questions, and perhaps I can help you a little bit more effectively with pacing. Have a good week, and I look forward to talking with you in chat. Bye.